Hey, welcome, and thanks for joining. You can see I'm in my favorite spot as of late. Tend to be hiding out here and working on some of these pieces. I can't wait to get these things up and running and get a chance to kind of spend some time and listen to them and base some impressions around them. And this one here is the Yamaha CA1010. It's getting very close to getting a chance to get it dialed in and start testing it. I want to talk to you a little bit about an amplifier that I tested a while ago, maybe now about 2 months ago. I parted ways with it. We found a new home for it. And that particular amplifier, made by one of my very favorite Japanese manufacturers, Technics. I've had a bunch of Technics pieces. In fact, Technics made my very first stereo that I bought back in 1983. And I've also had some of Technics' brand new products, including their new integrated amplifiers and speakers. And let me tell you, those are something special. Now, this amplifier I purchased was kind of a substitute, let's call it, for one that I featured on the Vintage Vibe before it was the Vintage Vibe, and that was a Technics SE-A3. But those amplifiers are becoming very, very hard to obtain today because the prices have really skyrocketed, kind of like some vintage Marantz pieces. Now, the SE-A5, the one we're going to talk about today, is still pretty obtainable. And we're going to talk a little bit about why. I mean, should it be worth more? What should it be worth in 2021? And obviously, what is it worth today? And if you acquire one, what you can expect for service, some impressions on how the unit actually sounds, and we'll talk about how it compares to the bigger brother, the SE-A3, and ultimately whether or not that unit deserves a place in your vintage audio collection. Thanks, and stick around.
Stunning. In one word, that probably sums up the look of the SE-A series amplifiers by Technics. I mean, who couldn't love this face? Just check out those awesome power needles swinging left and right. I mean, all the way up to 300 watts per channel. Well, I mean, that's what Technics would want you to believe. But 120 watts per side is nothing to sneer at. And it's absolutely hypnotizing. A classic look, timeless.
Well, now you know one of the reasons why I just love Technics. I mean, they are simply beautiful pieces of gear. I mean, it's borderline art. And that was during a time period in the 1980s where a lot of manufacturers were building junk, quite frankly. So I don't know where Technics got their designers, but wow, I mean, absolutely gorgeous. Now, do they sound as good as they look? That's the big question that we're going to talk about. Now, I want to give you a little hint. They did pack a lot of technology in these amplifiers. They called them New Class A. In fact, they coined that term. And what they tried to do is mirror the operation of a Class A non-switching amplifier. Now, when an amplifier switches, as they call it, it creates switching distortion. So Class A eliminated that essentially by keeping those output transistors on all the time. And that's where some of that sweetness and magic comes in the sound of Class A. It also makes the amplifier run extremely hot because it's inefficient. So Technics kind of found a way to, well, get the best of both worlds. And they did that through what they called a sliding bias, where they really controlled the operation and the efficiency of the amplifier. And they were able to pick up that magic, or at least some of that magic of Class A, while still saying or staying efficient and not cooking the amplifier from the inside out. So let's take a peek in the amplifier, see what, how it's built. Let's talk a little bit about what to expect if you happen to find one.
Although not the same build quality of the SE-A3, it's still pretty impressive. decent sized heat sinks and capacitors in the center there in that power block. And right behind you can see the two speaker relays. We'll talk about those in a moment. Now when we zoom back in here, you can see the power transformer. It's quite a hefty transformer, and another relay there we just passed, which is for the protection circuit. Now, all in all, it's a well laid out amplifier. It's fairly easy to get at it. You can see right now we're zooming in on the two squares kind of in front of the capacitors, which are the synchro bias circuit. That's the magic behind Technics' new Class A. So let's talk a little bit about the service of the amplifier. The relays on these amplifiers are prone to trouble. So you can see I've cut a little piece of a business card and I've sprayed some deoxit in there between the contact points. And I slowly work it forward and backwards to get the oxidization off the relay.
So what will that do? Well, in a lot of cases, it will render the relay useful again. What ends up happening is as the relay's opening and closing, particularly for 20, 30 years, the contact points, the surfaces between the relay where they open and close, and electricity is arcing over that, starts to pit, starts to oxidize, and it will impede the flow of electricity. And ultimately, you'll start getting kind of unusual symptoms, which are, to me, quite common. For example, with a speaker relay, when it's failing, you'll notice one of the channels, like the left channel as you're listening, start to drop out the volume. And as you goose the volume, it kind of reestablishes itself. That's a sign of a bad relay. Now, the problem with the SE-A5, when you flip it upside down to get at the solder points, because you can't get your hands in there and lift the plastic caps off really to service it properly, you have to deconstruct the unit, literally removing pieces of the structure, the chassis, to get at the solder points to remove it. I took the time to do that because I never wanted to have to do it again, and I put in two brand new relays. It cost me about $40 to purchase the two parts, and if you've got the knowledge and the know-how to replace them, do it. If you don't, it's worthwhile paying someone to do it for you.
Now here's a neat feature. This is the power limiting switch that not only limits the power to about 30 watts per channel, but also turns on and off the meter display. Kind of neat. So you see here inputs for normal and DC operation, variable gain controls for left and right channels, as well as these hokey pokey speaker terminals, which really only allow for about 16 gauge. You have to twist it to click, and it's a point probably of upgrade.
So why two inputs? Well, one of them was if you didn't go out and purchase Technics DC preamplifier. You had a regular preamplifier, you would use the outputs on your preamplifier in to the normal inputs on the power amplifier. And there's actually capacitors that would be coupled in circuit, put right before the speaker outputs. And those capacitors will prevent DC current from getting to the speakers and damaging them. Now, it also does limit the frequency response a little bit on the amplifier. Now, whether or not we can hear down to 0 hertz and 100,000 kilohertz, which I think for the most part we've proven we can't, that's really not the argument. The DC operation, though, by removing the capacitors in the circuit, allow the amplifier to have a wider range of frequency response, and the argument is that it improves the fidelity of the amplifier. That's when you'd use the DC inputs.
How does it sound? I mean, it's a tight sounding amplifier with good taunt bass, and it really's got good high frequency extension without being bright, and a nice wide soundstage. It's pretty impressive.
What will it cost? Well, to me in 2021, it's kind of an audio bargain, considering what you have to pay for a good new amplifier or a good vintage amplifier. I mean, you can find them as cheap as about $650 if there happens to be one kind of sitting on the market. You can also quite easily pay $800, which is probably an average, and I've seen them creep upwards of $1,000 to $1,200 Canadian dollars. But if you look for one and you're willing to wait, this can be a bargain. And yes, it is a piece you should have in your vintage audio collection. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you next time on the Vintage Vibe.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.